Picture this. It's April 22nd, 1943, and massive gray waves are crashing into 42 merchant ships, crawling slowly across the freezing North Atlantic Ocean. Standing on the bridge of a British warship called HMS Duncan, Commander Peter Gretton stares out at the horizon, his heart pounding because he knows something terrifying. German submarines are already down there, listening in the darkness below. These underwater predators use special listening devices called hydrophones to track every single turn of the ship propellers, and they're broadcasting the convoy's exact location through the cold water like a giant flashing sign that screams, "We're right here! Come get us!" For months now, entire groups of German submarines called wolf packs have owned these waters, sinking ship after ship with brutal efficiency. But something incredible is about to happen in the next few days. New technology and desperate last-ditch tactics are about to flip this entire ocean war completely upside down. And the hunters who thought they were invincible are about to discover what it feels like to become the prey. Before we dive into this amazing story, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is going to blow your mind when we reveal exactly how the tables turned and the predators became the victims. Let's rewind to March 1943, which historians now call the absolute most dangerous moment of the entire Atlantic supply war. German submarines were destroying merchant ships so fast that Allied military planners couldn't ignore the crisis anymore. They were losing the war at sea, and everyone knew it. In just 4 brutal, bloody weeks, those German U-boats sent more than 100 cargo vessels straight to the bottom of the ocean. Think about what that means. Nearly 700,000 tons of food, fuel, weapons, and factory materials all lost forever in the freezing depths where no one could reach them. Britain, which doesn't have enough farmland to feed its own people and depends completely on ships bringing supplies from across the ocean, felt the pain immediately and intensely. Bread rations got even smaller, meaning families had less to eat every single day. Factories started slowing down because they didn't have the materials they needed. Oil reserves were running dangerously low, with fuel tanks getting emptier by the week. Without imported steel arriving on those cargo ships, aircraft construction basically stopped, which meant fewer planes to defend the country. The convoy system, which was literally Britain's only lifeline connecting it to the rest of the world, looked like it was about to completely collapse. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, one of history's toughest leaders, later admitted in his private writings that the submarine problem haunted him every single night and scared him more than anything else in the entire war. And this is coming from a man who lived through constant bombing raids on London. The really terrifying part? The German submarine fleet was barely losing any boats in return, which made the whole situation completely unsustainable for the Allies. Here's the math that kept military planners awake at night. For every single German submarine that got destroyed, Allied convoys were sacrificing 10 merchant ships. 10 to 1. Think about how insane that ratio is. Military analysts started quietly warning each other in closed-door meetings that if things continued at this horrifying speed, Britain might literally starve to death by summer. We're talking about an entire nation running out of food within months. In Liverpool, at a place called Western Approaches Command, military officers tracked every single loss on this massive wall map that took up an entire room. They used red pins to mark where ships went down, and those pins pierced the ocean on the map like fresh wounds, spreading outward in every direction, clustering thick along the shipping lanes like a disease spreading across a body. Staff meetings grew incredibly tense, with voices getting sharper and angrier, as everyone in those rooms could feel it in their bones. The ocean was slipping away from Allied control, and there wasn't anything they could do to stop it. Meanwhile, out on those freezing waves, merchant ship crews faced absolute terror every single night. Their weapons were pathetic, maybe a few old guns that barely worked. The escort warships protecting them were completely overworked, running on fumes and exhausted crews. The anti-submarine equipment they had was so outdated, it might as well have been from the previous century. Every sunset brought a new nightmare, because that's when German U-boats would surface from the depths. overtake the slow-moving convoys using their superior surface speed, and slip right between the columns of ships. Completely invisible in the moonlit ocean spray and darkness, survivors who lived through these attacks talked about explosions that erupted without any warning at all. Just sudden massive blasts in the night. They described oil tankers splitting completely in half like someone snapping a stick, with flames racing across the oil slicks on the water, turning the ocean into a lake of fire. Men got hurled into the freezing black water where they had maybe 5 or 10 minutes to live before hypothermia killed them. That's how cold the North Atlantic is, cold enough to kill you in minutes. Radio silence policies meant that when a ship got damaged, it couldn't call for help. So it just drifted alone in the darkness, slowly sinking while the convoy moved on. Merchant sailors, who were just regular civilian guys keeping the supply chain alive, started calling their route across the Atlantic the Graveyard Run, because so many of them never made it back home. Germany had all the momentum, all the advantages, and it genuinely looked like the Atlantic Ocean was about to swallow the entire British Empire whole. To really understand why these convoys suffered so brutally, you need to look at the genius strategy the Germans developed beneath the waves. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the German submarine fleet, had perfected this incredibly sophisticated system built on 3 things: patience, constant communication between submarines, and overwhelming coordinated force. Instead of just sending lone submarines out to attack randomly whenever they found a target, Dönitz organized his U-boats into these virtual nets spread across likely convoy routes, kind of like setting up a massive spider web and waiting for prey to wander in. Each submarine would maintain complete radio silence, just drifting quietly in the water with their hydrophone listening devices pressed against the ocean, like someone putting their ear to a wall to hear what's happening on the other side. The moment even one submarine commander heard that distant churning sound of dozens of propellers, which meant a convoy was approaching, he would quickly surface just long enough to send out a contact report using his radio. Within just a few hours, 20 or sometimes even 30 submarines would converge on that single location from all directions, creating this coordinated attack that the British escorts simply couldn't handle. At night, these U-boats gained their most terrifying advantage over the merchant ships. German submarines were actually faster on the surface than the cargo ships they were hunting, so they could weave through the columns of merchants completely undetected, with their black hulls blending perfectly into the heaving dark water. Torpedoes would flash silently through the waves, completely invisible until they detonated against steel hulls, with this murderous precision that sent ships to the bottom in seconds. British escort ships would scramble to respond, racing around trying to find the attackers, but darkness concealed absolutely everything except the flames from burning ships. Desperate sailors would start throwing cargo overboard trying to lighten their sinking vessels, only to feel the entire ship breaking apart beneath their feet as water rushed in. During those terrible weeks in March 1943, messages from attacked convoys arrived at headquarters almost every single hour. That's how constant the slaughter was. One captain filed a report saying he personally watched 3 large freighters vanish beneath the waves within 90 seconds, one right after another. Boom, 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 gone. The real secret weapons of these wolf packs were the hydrophone operators, who became these unseen heroes of the German submarine campaign. These guys would sit in the submarine wearing padded headphones for hours, listening incredibly carefully for the rolling thump, thump, thump sound of propeller screws turning on steel drive shafts. They got so good at this that they could identify what type of cargo ship they were hearing just by the rhythm, the speed, and the specific vibration pattern the propellers made. On quiet nights when the ocean was calm, these skilled operators could detect a convoy from more than 80 nautical miles away. That's almost 100 regular miles of distance, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. Allied commanders, who were basically blind without radar technology that could see beyond visual range, constantly misjudged just how many predators were lurking below the surface, waiting to strike. As these German tactics evolved and got more sophisticated, Allied morale just completely plunged into the toilet. British escort captains would exhaust themselves chasing phantom contacts, dropping depth charges into empty stretches of ocean because they thought they heard something, wasting precious resources on nothing. Convoy commanders filed increasingly frantic reports back to headquarters, basically begging for help and better equipment. High-level administrators started seriously debating whether they should just abandon certain routes entirely and accept that some parts of the ocean belonged to Germany now. In shipping company offices across Britain, clerks would pull names from personnel rosters when ships went missing, marking sailors as lost with these practiced hollow pen strokes that showed they'd done this terrible task hundreds of times before. It had become routine to mark men as dead. By March 1943, the Atlantic situation had reached what military historians call an absolute breaking point, where something had to change or everything would collapse. Convoy damage reports showed losses rising faster than shipyards could physically build replacement hulls. They were losing ships quicker than they could make new ones. In just 30 brutal days, German submarines sent 120 Allied merchant ships to the bottom of the ocean. That's nearly 700,000 tons of food, fuel, and raw materials just swallowed by the sea and gone forever. Military logisticians stared at graphs on their desks that showed lines dipping lower every single week, trending toward complete disaster. Britain relied on imported grain to make bread, imported oil to run vehicles, imported machine parts to build weapons. They even imported uniforms for their soldiers. Almost everything came from overseas. With warehouses getting emptier and thinner every day, real panic started creeping into British cabinet meetings like fog rolling along a harbor dock. Winston Churchill admitted years later in his memoirs that the submarine threat frightened him more deeply than any German bomb falling on London during the Blitz. And that's really saying something because London was getting pounded by bombs constantly. In cramped military war rooms lit by dim lights, staff officers would trace paths with red pins across convoy routes on their giant maps. And some of those shipping lanes looked exactly like bleeding, wounds carved across the ocean. Millions of British civilians had absolutely no idea they were standing at the very edge of mass starvation. They just knew rations kept getting smaller. Meanwhile, over in Germany, Admiral Dönitz was celebrating his victories. The Wolfpack strategy had matured into this deadly predictable rhythm. Make contact with a convoy. Converge submarines from multiple directions. Attack from all sides at once. Then retreat and disappear before the escorts could organize a proper counterattack. German submarines absolutely loved the darkness because they could sometimes launch torpedoes at nothing but a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, not even needing to identify the exact target. Their commanders would write reports back to headquarters bragging about convoys they'd completely shattered, and British escorts they'd left chasing shadows all night long. From Berlin, German resources poured into submarine construction pens, with workers welding more and more steel hulls under these incredibly thick concrete roofs that were completely impervious to British bombs. You literally couldn't destroy these pens from the air no matter how hard you tried. The real cost of all this fell on merchant sailors, who were mostly just regular civilian guys, not military personnel. They would sleep in shifts, knowing that a torpedo could flash through the hull at any second, like a fist punching through paper, just sudden death with no warning. Many ships carried fuel oil or gasoline as cargo, and when those got hit, the explosions would light up the entire sky brighter than military flares, turning night into day for a few terrible seconds. Survivors would cling desperately to floating debris with their teeth chattering in the freezing water, watching their ship and their lifeline just fade away into smoke and disappear, knowing they probably had minutes to live before the cold killed them. Letters from British naval officers back to headquarters grew increasingly grim and hopeless. Some officers flat out admitted in writing that they simply could not protect all the ships in their charge anymore. The task was impossible. Others kept desperately asking for radar equipment and aircraft support that just didn't exist yet, because the technology wasn't ready or wasn't available in sufficient numbers. The oceans felt impossibly vast and empty when you were out there trying to protect dozens of vulnerable ships. The escort forces seemed pitifully small compared to the size of the threat. and the German hunters felt like they were literally everywhere at once, striking from any direction. But right when the Allied situation appeared completely hopeless and beyond saving, something remarkable started happening behind the scenes. In locked rooms behind blackout curtains across Britain, teams of engineers, scientists, and codebreakers worked through absolutely sleepless nights, pulling constant shifts to assemble this suite of technological innovations that had never been used together before in naval warfare. The first major breakthrough was something called high-frequency direction finding, which everyone nicknamed Huff Duff, because that was easier to say. Instead of British escorts just searching blindly across empty ocean hoping to stumble onto a submarine, they could now instantly detect the exact direction. A radio burst came from the very second a German U-boat commander touched his Morse code key to send a message. When two or more escort ships both detected the same transmission, they could triangulate the bearings and pinpoint almost exactly where that submarine was located, effectively turning every single German radio message into a self-inflicted beacon that screamed, "I'm right here! Come get me!" Suddenly, the Germans' greatest tactical advantage, coordinated communication between submarines, became their worst vulnerability. The second breakthrough came from advanced radar technology, but not the kind that German submariners were familiar with or could detect with their warning receivers. This was 10-centimeter wavelength radar that completely ignored German electronic warning systems. Their detection equipment literally couldn't see it. Allied aircraft equipped with this new radar could flash across stormy skies completely undetected by the submarines below, then pounce on U-boats the instant they surfaced to recharge their batteries. German commanders started filing reports saying they felt like they were being stalked by ghosts or invisible predators because planes would just appear out of nowhere and attack when they should have been safe. Then came something called ultra-intelligence, which was maybe the biggest game-changer of them all. At a secret facility called Bletchley Park, teams of brilliant codebreakers managed to crack the German naval Enigma cipher machine, which meant they could read German military orders almost as quickly as those orders were being sent to submarines. British convoys could now alter their course hours or even days before wolf packs arrived at the ambush point, moving through the ocean like chess pieces, guided by unseen hands that knew the enemy's every move. German U-boats would sail confidently into their planned attack positions only to find absolutely empty water. The convoys had taken different routes because British intelligence knew exactly where the ambush was supposed to happen. All those carefully coordinated Wolfpack ambush lines got completely wasted, attacking nothing. Very long-range aircraft finally closed what military planners called the infamous air gap in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. These were Liberator, bombers specially fitted with extra fuel, tanks so they could fly incredibly long distances, and they finally carried radar, depth charges, and machine guns to patrol areas where no Allied plane had ever been able to reach before. The ocean safe zone where submarines used to operate freely just shrank and shrank until eventually nothing remained. There was nowhere left to hide. Finally, ship-to-ship voice radio technology linked every escort vessel together in real-time communication. Instead of trying to use signal lamps through rain and smoke, which was incredibly slow and unreliable, escort commanders could now coordinate instantly, moving destroyers and corvettes around like they were all part of a single fighting machine. Where once escort ships acted completely alone and isolated, now they could attack in coordinated packs of their own, turning German tactics against them. Here's the crucial thing to understand. None of these individual tools alone could have stopped the slaughter that was happening. But when you put them all together, they formed something completely new and revolutionary. This living network of sensors, radios, aircraft, and codebreakers, all working together seamlessly. The Atlantic Ocean itself began whispering secrets to the Allies through this technological web, and every single secret pointed directly toward a German submarine that was about to get hunted down and destroyed. By late April 1943, a new convoy gathered in Liverpool's cold, salt-covered docks, getting ready for the dangerous journey across the Atlantic. 42 merchant ships formed themselves into 12 neat columns, all bound west toward North America, where they would collect precious cargo desperately needed back in Britain. Their escort group, which was officially designated B-7, sailed under the command of Commander Peter Gretton, the same guy we met at the beginning of this story. His 2 destroyers and supporting corvettes carried all the newest technology that British engineers had developed. Those Huff-Duff antennas for detecting radio transmissions, the new 10-centimeter radar that submarines couldn't detect, and real-time voice radios for instant coordination. The crews had drilled incredibly hard at a training base in Londonderry, learning to react in literal seconds instead of minutes, because every second counted in submarine warfare. Nobody on those ships knew it yet, but their convoy was destined to fight what would become the most critical and important battle of the entire Atlantic War, the engagement that would prove whether all this new technology actually worked in real combat conditions. On April 28th, a German submarine with the designation U-650 picked up the distinctive rumbling sound signature of multiple merchant ship propellers through its hydrophones. The submarine commander surfaced briefly, just long enough to send a single contact report to German headquarters, letting them know he'd found a juicy target. But something happened that the Germans weren't expecting. Instantly, within seconds, Commander Gretton's Huff-Duff operators caught the exact bearing of that transmission. Their detection needles snapped sharply to the left, then steadied like compass arrows pointing directly at the enemy submarine. British escort ships immediately accelerated at full speed toward that line of transmission, racing to attack before the submarine could escape. The German U-boat tried to dive and get away, but it was too late. Radar-equipped Allied aircraft flying from bases in Iceland forced the submarine to stay underwater again and again, never giving it a chance to surface long enough to shadow the convoy and send position updates. As hours slowly passed, more and more German U-boats started gathering for the attack, converging on the convoy's last known position. Then the weather turned absolutely vicious and brutal. A massive gale came screaming across the Atlantic, with towering waves ripping ships right out of their careful formations. Merchant ship captains fought desperately to maintain their assigned positions, but many vessels fell behind and got separated from the main convoy. The strict radio silence policies made coordination even harder because ships couldn't talk to each other. Ocean spray froze instantly on metal railings, coating everything in ice. Visibility collapsed into these white shards of wind and water where you couldn't see anything beyond a few yards. Officers on the bridge later swore they could literally smell the cold steel of approaching danger in the air. That's how tense everyone was. By May 3rd, Commander Gretton's destroyer, HMS Duncan, was running critically low on fuel, after weeks of high-speed chases burning through oil reserves. After spending so much time racing around at maximum speed, chasing submarine contacts and protecting the convoy, the Duncan finally had to limp away toward Newfoundland to refuel or risk running completely empty in the middle of the ocean. Command of the escort group passed to Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherwood aboard a ship called HMS Tay. He was now in charge of protecting 40-plus merchant vessels, when the terrible weather suddenly calmed down and thick fog rolled in to replace the storm. Many sailors believed the sea itself was holding its breath before something terrible happened. Hidden beneath that gray blanket of fog where nobody could see them, more than 50 German submarines were quietly closing in on the convoy from all directions. This was it. The largest wolf pack of the entire war had finally found its prey, and every single U-boat commander thought they were about to participate in the greatest slaughter of Allied shipping ever recorded. Night fell hard on May 5, 1943, and a suffocating blanket of fog settled over everything like a wet wool blanket. These thick walls of gray reduced visibility down to just a few yards. Sailors standing on deck could watch the ropes in their hands vanish into nothing just feet away. For the German submarine commanders prowling beneath the surface, these conditions promised an absolute slaughter because they figured their dark silhouettes would be completely invisible in the fog. They crept slowly toward the convoy, confident and eager, already imagining the tonnage reports they'd file after this massacre. At exactly 10 o'clock at night, German torpedoes sliced silently through the dark water toward their targets. 3 merchant ships erupted almost simultaneously, with flames glowing eerily through the thick fog like ghostly lanterns floating in the darkness. Survivors later described the horror of hearing men screaming for help, but not being able to see anything at all except smoke and fire. The fog was so thick you couldn't even see where the screams were coming from. But something was different this time, something the Germans absolutely didn't expect and couldn't understand, as U-boat commanders surfaced just long enough to transmit their success reports back to headquarters, bragging about their kills. Those radio transmissions instantly lit up the huff-duff-bearing displays on every British escort ship. Lieutenant Commander Sherwood, now in charge of the entire escort force, used the real-time voice radio network to direct corvettes and destroyers with a precision that had never been seen before in naval warfare. Commands rang out crystal clear over the radio. "Turn to port now! Accelerate to full speed! Begin depth charge run!" There was no waiting around for signal lamp messages that took forever to send through fog. No more guessing where to go. British escorts pounced on submarine positions as soon as radio transmissions crackled through the air. They didn't search blindly anymore. They hunted directly toward confirmed enemy positions. That 10-centimeter radar pierced through the fog like sunlight cutting through clouds, seeing what human eyes couldn't possibly see. German submarines attempting to surface for fresh air suddenly found British destroyers already accelerating toward them at ramming speed, appearing out of the fog like vengeful ghosts. The ocean exploded with depth charges, sending twin towers of white water shooting hundreds of feet into the air, as underwater explosives pounded submarine hulls beneath the waves with tremendous force. Oil slicks blossomed across the surface like dark flowers, marking where submarines had been damaged and were leaking. German commanders literally could not understand how British escorts always seemed to approach from exactly the correct bearing, as if the British were somehow reading their minds or seeing through solid metal. British support groups arrived throughout the battle, bringing fresh fuel supplies and more depth charges, keeping the escort ships at fighting strength. German U-boats desperately trying to escape would carefully rise to periscope depth, only to immediately hear the rising electronic ping-ping-ping sound of British ASDIC sonar getting louder and louder as destroyers closed in on them. Inside those steel submarine hulls, German sailors gripped pipes and prayed to God as British depth charges detonated all around them. Explosions buckled metal bulkheads inward like crumpling aluminum foil. Lights fizzled and went out, plunging compartments into darkness. Pressure gauges spiked into the red danger zones as seawater started forcing its way through tiny cracks. Throughout all this chaos and violence, the merchant ships in the convoy stayed mostly intact and afloat. That was the real miracle. British escort ships formed protective screens around the merchants, sprinting from target to target, using coordinated attack patterns that would have been completely impossible just months earlier. For the first time in the entire Atlantic War, a major German submarine attack actually stalled out and failed. Hours dragged on through the night. More and more submarines slipped away from the battle with leaking ballast tanks, trailing oil behind them like wounded sharks, leaving blood in the water. A completely new kind of fear crept into German hearts that night. The terrifying idea that the ocean might not hide them anymore, that they were the ones being hunted now. As dawn broke across the Atlantic on May 6, 1943, signals intelligence data poured into Western Approach's command headquarters like storm water rushing through gutters after a heavy rain. The reports coming in from the convoy were absolutely shocking, but different from the devastating losses everyone had seen just weeks earlier. Yes, 13 merchant ships had been lost, which was still a terrible price to pay. But here's what changed everything. 6 German submarines were confirmed destroyed with all hands lost, and several more had been so badly damaged they'd never fight again. For the first time in any major convoy engagement during the entire war, German U-boat losses actually exceeded Allied merchant ship losses. The balance of power, which had been tilted so heavily toward Germany for so long, had finally begun to shift back the other direction. British ships loaded with radar and huff-duff. Equipment started multiplying across the Atlantic, like nerves forming across a wounded organism that was learning to fight back. New escort carriers began deploying aircraft directly into convoy lanes, eliminating that once untouchable mid-Atlantic air gap where submarines used to operate freely. German submarine commanders staring at gauges deep below the surface started filing reports about sudden sonar pings and approaching propeller sounds that seemed to find them no matter where they hid. The ocean, which used to feel silent and safe, no longer felt that way. Now it felt crowded and dangerous, full of enemies who could somehow see in the dark. Admiral Dönitz sat at his desk in Berlin watching casualty reports pile up higher and higher. 43 U-boats lost during May alone. That was a full quarter of his entire operational fleet gone in 1 month. German factories, already strained by fighting a war on multiple fronts, simply could not build submarines fast enough to keep up with these losses. Meanwhile, Britain was launching new escort ships every single month, strengthening air patrols constantly, and refining anti-submarine tactics faster than German commanders could even write them down in their manuals. German submariners started whispering darker truths to each other below decks when officers weren't listening. Depth charge explosion patterns seemed too perfect to be just coincidence or luck. It felt like the British knew exactly where they were. Radar contact seemed to pierce through any weather conditions. Voices from Allied escort ships coordinated instantly across miles of ocean. Real superstition started creeping into submarine crews. Some young sailors genuinely believed that new British ships could somehow see through storms using magic or supernatural powers. That's how incomprehensible the technology seemed. Back in Germany, families across the country received cold official telegrams stamped with naval service crests, informing them that their sons or husbands were missing and presumed lost at sea. Thousands and thousands of young German men vanished forever beneath the waves, inside pressure hulls that got warped and crushed by imploding steel. The vibrant pride and confidence of the German submarine service, which used to be this elite force that feared nothing, slowly dimmed into growing dread and fear of every patrol. Within just a few weeks after that pivotal May battle, German submarine commanders confronted a terrible realization that changed the entire war. The Atlantic Ocean that had once sheltered and protected them had somehow learned to answer back and fight. June washed across the Atlantic with calmer, quieter seas and gentler weather. But beneath that peaceful surface, the German submarine fleet was completely unraveling and falling apart. Admiral Dönitz made the painful decision to pull most U-boats away from the main convoy routes, ordering them to new patrol areas and giving them revised tactics to try. But every single adjustment and change arrived too late to make any difference. Very long-range Allied aircraft now roamed the entire ocean, with radar systems sweeping smooth horizons looking for periscopes and conning towers. German submarines would surface cautiously to recharge batteries and get fresh air, only to find an aircraft silhouette already diving toward them from the clouds above. Depth charges already rolling off the wings like thunder from an angry sky. Safe zones in the Atlantic, which used to be vast and plentiful, shrank down to just scattered tiny pockets of water that kept getting smaller. New British support groups made up of destroyers and frigates started operating completely independently of convoys, hunting submarines purely based on intelligence reports. When the codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted German routing orders telling submarines where to go, British commanders would dispatch ships days ahead of any contact, setting up ambushes. German wolf packs would sail confidently into what they thought were good patrol positions, only to sail straight into carefully prepared traps. Their careful coordination fractured under constant jamming of radio signals and surprise attacks from multiple directions. Huff-duff triangulation revealed even brief fleeting radio bursts within seconds of transmission. Each coded message a submarine sent became a beacon pointing directly at another steel coffin about to sink. German shipyards struggled desperately to replace lost submarine hulls, working around the clock. But skilled crews, the real true lifeblood of the submarine service, couldn't be replaced at all. You can build a new submarine in months, but you can't create an experienced crew overnight. Training programs accelerated, rushing inexperienced crews through faster and faster. But these rookie crews kept making fatal mistakes, surfacing at exactly the wrong times when aircraft were nearby, diving too deep and crushing their own hulls under pressure, or misjudging bearing directions from sonar pings and running straight toward destroyers instead of away. Very few of these rookie crews returned from their first patrol to learn from their mistakes. They just died. Inside Berlin's war rooms, staff officers looked at maps that used to be cluttered with confident arrows showing German advances and submarine patrol zones. Now those same maps showed mostly blank spaces. The red pins marking sunken Allied freighters dwindled to almost nothing. Black crosses marking lost U-boats multiplied across the charts like a spreading plague. Dönitz wrote quietly in his private diary that technological supremacy, not courage or tactics, now ruled the Atlantic Ocean, and Germany didn't have that supremacy anymore. Meanwhile, Allied convoys surged steadily toward Britain in growing numbers, feeding factories with raw materials, fueling military vehicles with gasoline, and filling ammunition belts bound for Europe with bullets and shells. Merchant ship captains who had spent months living in constant terror slowly began to believe they might actually survive this war and live to see peace. For the surviving German submariners still at sea, the war had turned into a haunted voyage where every day felt like borrowed time. Rumors swept through submarine crews like wildfire. Stories about British radar that could see through storms, about aircraft that hunted in complete darkness, about computers that could read German messages instantly. Whether these rumors were completely true or exaggerated didn't really matter anymore. The fear they created was very real, and it hollowed out crew morale and resolve. Men braced for depth charge explosions that often arrived just moments later, living in constant anticipation of sudden, violent death. The Atlantic Ocean no longer belonged to the hunters who had once ruled it with impunity. Now it belonged to those who had learned to hear every whisper the sea made, who had turned technology into an unstoppable advantage. By late 1943, the transformation was absolutely undeniable to everyone. Allied convoys sailed with fewer gaps between ships, escort vessels bristled with antennas sticking up everywhere, and aircraft patrolled endlessly overhead. German submarines that once prowled through rich hunting grounds full of easy targets now crept nervously beneath thermoclines, layers of different temperature, water that might hide them from sonar, rationing their battery power carefully and fearing every single distant propeller beat they heard through the hull. Submarine losses mounted faster than German shipyards could possibly weld replacement steel together. Even more devastating than losing the actual submarine hulls was the loss of seasoned, experienced crews whose instincts and skills had once guided silent, deadly stalks. In the end, nearly 30,000 German submariners would die during the Battle of the Atlantic, a casualty rate that remained unmatched by any other branch of military service in any country during the entire war. For the Allies, this victory carried incredibly heavy shadows too. More than 70,000 merchant sailors and naval personnel perished, keeping those supply lanes open and alive. Their names rarely appeared in newspaper headlines or history books, yet without their tremendous sacrifice, the Normandy invasion would never have been supplied with enough equipment. Allied forces in Africa would never have been reinforced properly, and Britain itself might not have survived at all as an independent nation. Historians who studied this campaign later called the Battle of the Atlantic the longest continuous military campaign of World War II and described it as the war's longest heartbeat, the steady pulse that kept everything else alive. Every single convoy that arrived safely in port meant factories could continue forging weapons, hospitals stayed lit and supplied with medicine, and dinner plates across Britain didn't stay empty. After May 1943, German U-boat operations continued and submarines still went out on patrol, but they never returned to anywhere near their previous ferocity and effectiveness. Each technological advantage the Allies developed, Huff-Duff direction finding, ultra-code-breaking intelligence, that incredible 10-centimeter radar, and long-range patrol aircraft, tightened the noose around German submarines more and more. The once feared wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic completely dissolved into isolated individual predators being hunted relentlessly wherever they went. Admiral Donitz eventually withdrew most submarines from the Atlantic in desperation, privately admitting to his staff that the ocean had turned permanently hostile to German operations, and there was nothing he could do about it anymore. Yet this victory wasn't claimed by machines and technology alone. That's really important to understand. It emerged from patient refinement over months and years, from midnight sessions of engineering problem-solving, from courageous escort crews who kept fighting despite terrible odds, and from cryptanalysts working in quiet windowless rooms, breaking codes that seemed unbreakable. British Admiral Max Horton later noted in his official reports that no single invention or breakthrough saved the Atlantic campaign from disaster. Rather, it was the integration and coordination of multiple advantages working together that finally changed fate and turned the tide. When peace finally returned to the Atlantic Ocean after years of war, sailors spoke very softly and respectfully about burning tankers they'd watched sink, about shattered hulls breaking apart, about voices of dying men being swallowed by freezing water in the darkness. The Atlantic Ocean kept many stories locked away in its depths, where they'll never be recovered. But one fundamental truth endured and survived to be told. Sometimes wars don't pivot on a single dramatic moment or one big battle, but rather when small advantages start to align and stack up together, tipping the scale forever in one direction. In that spring of 1943, the hunters who thought they ruled the ocean became the hunted prey running for their lives, and the heartbeat of an island nation that was on the verge of dying continued to beat strong and steady.